You know how we always talk about having our mom's eyes or our dad's sense of humor? Well, it turns out the real story of how we get our traits is one of the most fascinating and, yeah, surprisingly complicated tales in all of science.
I mean, it seems like a pretty basic question, doesn't it? How does the instruction manual for a living thing get copied and handed down through generations? But for almost all of human history, this was a total mystery.
And look, even the greatest minds, people like Charles Darwin, were completely stumped. He and pretty much everyone else bought into this idea of blending inheritance. The theory was that traits from your parents would just mix together, kind of like blending red and white paint to get pink. It makes a certain kind of sense, right? But it just couldn't explain how some traits could skip a generation entirely, or why you and your siblings can look so different.
So yeah, this was the big heredity puzzle. If everything was just blending, wouldn't all the interesting variations eventually disappear? Wouldn't we all just become a boring, average beige color over time? Clearly, that's not what happens. The puzzle was missing a piece, a totally new way of looking at the problem.
Okay, so on one side you've got that old blending idea, this smooth, irreversible mix. But what if inheritance wasn't like paint at all? What if it was more like Lego blocks? You know, discrete, individual units that get passed down whole. They can be snapped together in new combinations, but the blocks themselves, the red one, the blue one, they never change.
And the guy who cracked this code wasn't some famous scientist in a state-of-the-art lab. Nope, it was a monk, Gregor Mendel, who was just meticulously breeding pea plants in his garden. And through these incredibly careful experiments, he gave us the first clear rules of the genetic game.
What Mendel figured out is what we now call simple, or Mendelian inheritance. The big idea is that for a lot of these simple traits, there's just one gene calling the shots. And this gene comes in different versions, which we call alleles. Here's the kicker. One of those alleles can be totally dominant over the other, the recessive one. So it's not a blend, it's more like a power struggle.
Let's make this super simple with a classic example, a widow's peak hairline. So if the allele for a widow's peak, we'll call it big W, is dominant, you only need one copy of it to actually have that V-shaped hairline. You could be big W or big W little w. Either way, you get the widow's peak. The only way to get a straight hairline is to get two copies of the recessive allele, little w. See? No blending, just one bossing the other around.
Now, Mendel's real stroke of genius wasn't just finding these rules. It was giving us a way to predict the outcome. He came up with the Punnett square, which is just a brilliantly simple tool to map out the odds.
And you can totally do this yourself. It's so easy. You just draw a little 2x2 grid. Then you put the two alleles from one parent across the top and the two alleles from the other parent down the side. Then it's just a matter of filling in the boxes, combining the letter from the top with the letter from the side. It's basically a genetic tic-tac-toe.
So let's look at what happens with two of Mendel's pea plants. Each one carries a dominant allele for purple flowers, B, and a recessive one for white, B. This mix is called heterozygous. When we fill out the square, you can see the four possibilities for their offspring, one BB, two that are BB, and one little BB.
And here's where the magic happens. We translate that genetic code into what we can actually see. Since that big B for purple is dominant, any box with a big B in it is going to result in a purple flower. Well, that's 3 out of the 4 boxes. Only that one lonely BB box gives you a white flower. And there it is, that legendary 3-to-1 ratio of traits. 75% purple, 25% white. So cool, right?
Okay, so these rules are the foundation, the basic model. But things start to get really interesting when the genes we're talking about are on the very chromosomes that determine our sex. This adds a whole new twist to the story.
We call these sex-linked traits. Now remember, females have 2 X chromosomes, but males have 1 X and 1 Y. And that Y chromosome is, well, it's kind of puny. It doesn't carry a lot of genes. So most of these traits are X-linked. And that changes the odds, especially for males, because they only get 1 X chromosome. They get one shot, no backup copy.
Let's take red-green color blindness. It's a classic recessive X-linked trait. So here we have a mother who is a carrier. She has the allele, but she can see color just fine, and a father who is unaffected. Now look at the possibilities for their son. He gets his only X chromosome from his mom. If he happens to get the X with that recessive allele on it, boom, he will be colorblind. There's no second X chromosome to provide the dominant allele for normal vision. And that's exactly why these kinds of traits are so much more common in men.
So far, everything seems pretty tidy, right? We've got these simple rules, predictable outcomes, widow's peaks, flower colors. It almost makes genetics feel like a solved puzzle. But this beautiful simplicity, it's actually pretty deceptive. Are we really just a simple collection of traits that are neatly determined by single genes? Or is the picture, I don't know, infinitely more complex and messy than that?
There's a great quote from geneticist Aofi McClissagot that just nails it. The alluring simplicity of Mendel's laws sometimes obscures the true complexity of genetics. See, Mendel was a genius because he simplified the problem. He very deliberately chose traits that were clear-cut, black and white. But most of life isn't like that at all.
And this elegant simplicity has led to probably the single biggest misunderstanding in all of science. It's this idea of the gene for something. You know, the gene for being smart, the gene for being tall, the gene for a certain disease.
The truth is, that's almost always a myth. Most of the traits we really care about are not Mendelian. They're not controlled by one gene. Your height, for example, is influenced by thousands of genes, and those genes are all talking to each other, interacting in complex ways, and, this is huge, they're also interacting with the environment, your nutrition, your lifestyle, even just random chance. It's this incredibly complex web. I mean, think about it. Even identical twins who have the exact same genes are not perfect copies of each other.
So if our genes aren't some simple, straightforward instruction manual, what are they? A much better way to think about it is this. Our genes don't determine our destiny, they shape our probabilities.
This is a really fundamental shift in how we see ourselves. We're moving away from that old idea of a rigid genetic blueprint that locks in who we're going to be. The modern view is that our genes create a landscape of possibilities. They give us certain tendencies, certain potentials, certain risks, but they absolutely do not write the final story.
And this is why this really matters. Let's say someone has a gene that puts them at a higher risk for heart disease. That does not mean they are doomed to have a heart attack. Not at all. By making healthy choices, what they eat, how much they exercise, they can fundamentally change those odds. They can shift the probabilities in their favor. We're not just passengers in our own bodies, we are active participants in our own health.
Which really brings us to one last, pretty profound question. If our genes aren't a blueprint, then what are they? Maybe they're more like a complex musical score. They provide the themes, the melodies, the structure, but the final performance, that beautiful, unpredictable, one-of-a-kind music of a human life, that's left up to the interplay between the notes, the environment, and the conductor. And that conductor is you.